While Donald Trump's son-in-law joins the president's unconvincing special envoy in playing a game of one-sided footsie with Russia, Vladimir Putin says he's ready for war. But should we really be worried? On the one hand, only today we in Britain have learnt of the ease with which Moscow's spies tracked down and poisoned the defected Russian intelligence officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter with a military-grade nerve agent in Salisbury in 2018, an attack that left one person dead but could have killed thousands. But then also, only today, the Prime Minister is meeting his Norwegian counterpart, Jonas Gahr Støre, at RAF Lossiemouth to sign a defence pact that will see our navies operate a combined fleet of warships to hunt Russian submarines and protect critical infrastructure in the North Atlantic. Meanwhile, in the background, China watches on, projecting the innocence of a benign and neutral superpower and waiting for the government to give the final green light to a super embassy in London that will become its biggest diplomatic outpost in the world. I don't doubt President Putin's words because of his lack of conviction. I doubt the tense. Because given what's at stake in Ukraine, the tone of his rhetoric, and the malign acts he's already authorised on British soil, he's not just ready for war, he's at war. The question I want answered is, are we? I'm Jeremy Griffin, the executive editor of The Times, and this is The Times at 1. So a public inquiry into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who died in Salisbury in 2018 after being exposed to the military-grade nerve agent Novichok, has found Vladimir Putin is morally responsible for her death. The inquiry said basic security measures were not set up for Russian double agent Sergei Skripal, who was poisoned at home in the town 4 months before Ms Sturgis was exposed. They included the fact that he was resettled under his own name, leaving him, and I quote, alarmingly accessible to attacks sent by President Putin. His daughter, Yulia, was also poisoned in the attack, which left both seriously ill and more than 80 people in hospital. We're going to talk now to the former British military intelligence officer, Philip Ingram. Philip, do you agree President Putin is morally responsible for these acts?
Oh, 100%. More than morally responsible. He is responsible because he will have been in the decision loop.
Quite right. The Skripal attack could have killed thousands. It did eventually end the life of Dawn Sturgis in the most horrendous way after she found a perfume bottle in a charity bin and innocently sprayed herself. The inquiry has found it was all preventable. If it's not too obvious a question, what went wrong?
It's easy with 2020 hindsight to say it's preventable. You know, at the time, the security service had their eye off the ball of the Russian threat and threats coming in from nation states because they were focused very much on counterterrorism. This is what really focused them back into looking at this hostile nation state threat that's there. But they should have had greater security measures on Sergei Skripal. Sergei Skripal himself had turned a lot of the security measures down. So this is a two-way flow whenever you resettle an agent. And he was unlucky. He was chosen because he lived in Salisbury. Because Vladimir Putin knew what he was doing, and he knew that the first thing he wanted to do whenever the British government accused him of attacking was to say, no, it must have escaped from the British chemical warfare establishment that's on the outside Salisbury at Porton Down, which is the first thing he did when Theresa May stood up in Parliament and accused Vladimir Putin of being behind it. And whenever she stood up and did that, the leader of the opposition then, Jeremy Corbyn, stood up and said, how can we prove it didn't escape? And Vladimir Putin was then sitting there going, I've created the confusion that's out there. That's all I wanted to do, as he stroked the white cat on his knee behind his big oak desk in Moscow.
I remember that day very, very well. Not one of the finest hours in British parliamentary history, it must be said. But why had we taken our eye off Russia at the time? Because, this is only, 4 years after they downed that jet over Ukraine,
Yep.
and 4 years after they'd invaded the Crimean Peninsula. They were making their motives as regards the future of Europe pretty clear at that stage.
They were, but this goes back to whenever the wall came down in Germany and it was peace in our time. The Cold War had finished. Russia was being brought back into the international community, member of the G8. We were increasing our business with them and all the rest of it. And these sort of other things were just sidelines. It wasn't something that we were taking the threat from the Russian state seriously. Now, we should have done with the poisoning a few years beforehand of Alexander Litvinenko with polonium-210 on the streets of of London and should have woken up then, but didn't. And this comes down to resources and the terrorist activity that was going on. Remember, 2017 was the horrific terrorist attacks in London, on London Bridge and elsewhere, and security services were tied up very much in dealing with that and dealing with that growing threat from the Islamist terrorists that were threatening the country. So with a finite number of resources, they made a decision not to put as much as they should have done against the nation-state threat. That decision has been proven, with 2020 hindsight, to be wrong.
But if I may, who is at fault for that? Because I do find it incredible. You mentioned Alexander Litvinenko. There's a very famous front page of the Times, actually, in which we pictured him. And he basically, I won't use the exact phrase that he used at the time, but he said that Russia had got him. We were well aware of what they could do on British soil. I get the point that we were very stretched because of ISIS attacks in those years. But surely someone must have said, look, the security threat from Russia is still so high that we need to give more money to our security forces.
Yeah, well, this comes down to the governments at the time. It comes down to the intelligence security committees at the time. It comes down to the heads of our intelligence services, and it comes down to the overall assessments. They got it wrong in looking at it. And there was a feeling that when the Cold War finished, that intelligence operations by hostile states would reduce. Actually, when you look at it, there were more intelligence officers in the Russian, Chinese embassies in London and other capital cities around the world than there had been beforehand. So their activities were increasing. And it's very difficult once you've let that genie get out of the bottle to try and put it back into the bottle again. And that's what led to the conditions where Russia could act with impunity with Alexander Litvinenko and then with Sergei Skripal. And unfortunately, resulting in the death several months after Sergei Skripal had been attacked, the unfortunate death of Dawn Sturgis, and the dose that she sprayed herself with was unsurvivable. But that interim period, again, there's a number of questions that haven't been answered, because when Colonels Mishkin and Chepiga, who were the GRU agents that went and smeared Novichok on the door handle of Sergei Skripal's house, they will have done that using a cloth. You don't spray it. This stuff, if it got on them, the tiniest little bit, a grain of salt would have killed them. And they wouldn't be able to cure themselves from that. They will have worn protective equipment. Where has that been? The bottle that Charlie Riley, Dawn Sturgis' then boyfriend, found and gave to her, we had the impression that this was wrapped up. It was unopened. Well, if it was unopened, that must have been a backup bottle. Where was the open bottle that they used, and what's happened to that, and how's that been disposed? None of these questions have been answered. So is there a threat still out there in the community? That is a question that has never been answered.
Well, with that in mind, I mean, it seems as though Dawn Sturgis was tragically what the Kremlin would describe as collateral damage. She was one person, that's bad enough. But what was in that bottle? She said it could have killed thousands of people. That's chilling enough in the context of international relations 7 years ago. How does that make you feel, given our relationship with Russia now?
Well, our relationship with Russia's got worse, and we've got Russia now sanctioning more and more people that are criticising the Kremlin, all on the back of what's going on in the war in Ukraine. And the threat is increasing. We're seeing other attacks from Russia at the moment, whether they be cyber attacks, whether they be surveying our underwater pipelines, and in many cases cutting them, or underwater cables, whether it be carrying out bomb attacks against DHL establishments, where there's parcels being moved around. And we've seen that, whether it be recruiting criminal gangs to burn warehouses down in London and elsewhere. We are being attacked on a daily basis in what is euphemistically described as the grey zone, below the threshold of war that would stimulate an ordinarily a military response to it. And this is something we need to wake up to and change our attitude and change what we do. At the moment, our response is a stiff letter.
Yeah. Given your expertise in the area, can you explain whether what we've heard from the inquiry is exceptional or all too typical? How are foreign intelligence agents usually protected? And how far up the command chain, for instance, does the knowledge of those protection details go?
Well, whenever you've resettled an agent, the fact that someone has been an agent is usually kept in a very, very close circle. And there is a little group that is responsible for making sure the security of different agents that have been resettled around the place. And each agent should have a threat assessment done against them, because everyone's got different circumstances that are there. And where that threat gets to a higher level, then you'll get people at the highest level of government, if necessary, will be briefed briefed, maybe not on all of the detail that's in there, but this is something where the threat assessment, the measures that were put in place, the team that was behind it have got it wrong, and it didn't result in the death of Sergei and Yulia Skripal, but there were enough indicators there to suggest that they could and would have been targets, and something else needed to be put in place. Unfortunately, Dawn Sturgis was collateral damage. She suffered hugely in this, and she died because there weren't the measures put in place to stop this attack at the very beginning. It's very difficult to stop an attack. If the Russians want to come and do it, they'll do it. And they could come in today and carry out a similar attack against numerous different targets, and we have to be very concerned about that.
And it sounds as though there are questions still to be answered as
very
well.
Much so.
Philip Ingram, former British military intelligence officer, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.